Charlotte Sometimes by Penelope Farmer, Chapter 4. There was work to be prepared that day for future lessons. This did not create such difficulty as it might have. Charlotte's handwriting, fortunately, was not unlike Claire's, since she had been taught to form her letters in the same old-fashioned way as Claire formed hers. Also, the system of work had not much changed between present and past. Charlotte, being organized and neat, followed it as meticulously as Claire had done, jotting down in the little notebooks provided not only the work to be done, but also the day by which it had to be handed in. They had been given an essay called My Holidays, and she was thankful that it could be left till another day. For how could she write an essay about Claire's holidays? She knew nothing about them, nor had she any means of finding out. And if she did write something and Emily read it, how suspicious she would be. If she was not suspicious already, as Charlotte had begun to think. She did arithmetic instead, long division of money, that she had learned when much younger and so found easy. Though she was not usually good at arithmetic, she also learned by heart the first 6 verses of a poem called Horatius at the Bridge. It began, Lars Porsensa of Clusium, by the 9 gods he swore that the great house of Tarquin should suffer wrong no more. It was stirring both to learn and recite, and kept on beating in Charlotte's head all that day and the next, in her own time. That morning, when Charlotte awoke, she found beside her bed an exercise book with a pale pink cover, the color usually used for scripture books, on which was written, Charlotte Mary Makepeace, and underneath, again was blacked over twice, very private. Charlotte hesitated before opening this. There was something disconcerting about a book that had her own name on it, that no one ought to have written except herself, and yet that she had not written, nor was her name now her property alone. Suppose that very private warned her not to open the book and read what was inside. Suppose that very private warned even her not to open the book and read what was inside. However, she opened it at last to read, not unexpectedly, but still disconcertingly, a message from someone whom she did not know and who was more than 40 years away from her. Dear Charlotte, she read, I think we should be able to write to each other to explain anything difficult. For instance, about work and about Emily. Please look after Emily. She's only 10. We could use this book here in my diary in 1918. It is that red book on the chair, but please do not read the earlier part. It is very private. Not even Emily may read it. I did your arithmetic for you today. I am afraid it was all wrong. I am so bad at arithmetic. Please write. I think it would help if we both write. Yours sincerely, Claire. P.S. I took this book from the classroom cupboard. It was very dishonest and wrong of me, but I could not think what else to do. Claire's arithmetic certainly was not good. Charlotte had the exercise book back that day, scored in red ink with only 2 marks given out of 10, and decided that in future she had better try to do it herself. She was going to suggest this to Claire that very evening in her own note, but it seemed rather unkind. And so, after all, she left it out. Dear Claire, she wrote, it was very clever of you to think of this book. I don't think it was too wrong to take it from the cupboard. We have to have a book, and there's no other way of finding one. I think grown-ups would say it was all right if they knew what was happening to us. I promise not to read your diary. I did open it just once to find out the date, but I promise on my honor I didn't read any more. I promise. By the way, do you think we should tell Emily what's happening? I'm sure she's suspicious, so it might be better. But I think you should tell her, perhaps, not me. Charlotte stopped and thought a little, and then added, How are you managing here? Did you find it very difficult and strange? For it had occurred to her suddenly how much harder it must be to move forward in time than to move back. At least in the past, many things were familiar, and you knew something about it. But what did you know about the future? Nothing except guesses, and many of them frightening. She would not have liked to move 40 or 50 years ahead of her own time, as Claire had moved ahead of hers. Susanna was saying curiously, Whatever do you find to write about? I kept a diary once, and all I could think to say was had breakfast, had lunch, had tea, went to bed. Oh, I just think of things, said Charlotte, ending her letter hastily with, I don't think anything important happened today. I'll write tomorrow. Yours sincerely, Charlotte. P.S. I can't understand why this is happening. P.P.P.S. I didn't look at your diary, honestly. Afterwards, out of the darkness, a voice came, Vanessa's voice. Charlotte, are you awake? Yes, of course. Janet and I are very puzzled. Why do you take such ages to say your prayers some nights before you get into bed, and not other nights at all? Well, some nights I say them in bed, Charlotte answered, glad of the dark. In fact, this was sometimes true. But from now on, she thought, she would have to do as Claire did and kneel beside her bed, much as she would hate to make such a display of holiness. Otherwise, the rest of them might become suspicious. It was odd, really, that they were not suspicious already. Charlotte lay awake some while that night. She could hear the sounds of traffic in the distance, blown downriver from the road bridge, and occasionally the sounds of trains, too, from the railway bridge. When the airplanes came, they blotted out all other sounds. She thought how frightening they must have seemed to Claire at first. Whatever had she thought such enormous sounds could be? The school itself was not so very different from the earlier one, but in 1918, so far, Charlotte had only heard one airplane, and that a tiny buzzing far away like a bluebottle fly. It had quite excited Emily, who cried, "A plane! A plane! Can you see it, Bunty? Can you see it, Claire?" These airplanes did not buzz unless it was inside your head, like something drilling there. Some roared, some screamed, some thundered, some did all three at once. Some made tight, narrow sounds, loud yet contained within a space. Others laid sound flat over your head like a kind of roof. Still others, and by far the worst, were heavy. They reverberated everywhere, as though the air made little invisible walls against which sound echoed, though it seemed to break in thunderous waves and surgings until it felt like being in a tent of sound pegged down close all round. Then sometimes Charlotte found it hard to remember who she was, Charlotte or Claire or someone quite different again. It was odd, disconcerting, this jerky proceeding of days and worlds both so different, and yet the movements of school alike, for they continued to change day after day. The earlier school was stricter, more drab, the food there both scarier and nastier. They had fur in the soup on Tuesday, underboiled fish on Wednesday, and on Thursday the most unpleasant pudding Charlotte had ever eaten. North Pole pudding, it was called, a kind of jelly made of cornmeal, gray like porridge, shiny like glue, and freckled with little pieces of meal, like the flaws in a glass. Emily would not eat it, and was made to sit in the dining room for hours, but she smuggled a plateful into her handkerchief when no one was looking, and reappeared in class triumphantly. Between Emily and Susanna and the rest, Charlotte felt as if she were reading two stories alternately, reaching some point of tension in one only to continue in the other. It was Friday, for instance, before she received an answer to her first note from Claire, which said, among other things, "I don't think we should tell Emily. I don't want to tell her because I think she might be frightened and not understand. Please, Charlotte, just go on acting as if you were me and not say anything, and look after her." But of course Charlotte could not look after Emily that day because it was her own time and there was no Emily. There were Janet and Vanessa instead, who seemed to be plotting something and giggled a great deal. After supper they said to Charlotte and Susanna, "Don't come up just yet. One of us will fetch you when we're ready." Charlotte went on ahead when the time came and opened the door to find the curtains drawn, the light wrapped in a sweater. A figure leaped out from the gloom, Vanessa, while Janet grabbed Susanna from behind. Susanna let out a giggle, a little sharp, nervous, "Oh!" "No," they were told by deep, croaking, cracking voices. "No, novices, you have tests to undergo. Lie down and look up these." These were dressing-gown sleeves, and trembled because Janet and Vanessa, who held them, were laughing so much. Only Elizabeth took no part. She lay in her bed with her back to everyone, reading by the light of a flashlight, and Charlotte heard her radio faintly, indecipherably growl. She was waiting, apprehensive, for something to happen, staring up through the tunnel of the dressing-gown sleeve. It was Janet's dressing-gown, very thick and hairy, tickling her mouth and nose, making her want to sneeze. She could see an uneven round of light at the top of it. But this was suddenly obscured by what she could not tell, except that it made a darkness there. Behold the sights of Venus, intoned Vanessa's voice above Charlotte's and Janet's, above Susanna's. Charlotte screwed up her eyes to see, but could make nothing out at all. The round of light appeared again, and was once more obscured. Behold the churches of Venice, they said, and afterwards again, behold the bridges of Venice. There was a long pause. The voices began at last more loudly and impressively than ever. Behold the canals of Venice, but were overcome by giggles well before the end. For down the dressing gown sleeves came a cascade of icy water into the faces of Charlotte and Susanna, who sat up choking, startled, bewildered, rubbing the water from their eyes and mouths, while Janet and Vanessa collapsed with laughing, clutched each other and laughed the more. What did you do that for? Cried Susanna indignantly, tearfully. I'm all wet. You made me wet. You made me all wet, they mimicked. That's the point, silly. That's the joke. It's the joke, you see. Well, I don't think it's awfully funny, that sort of thing, making people wet. Susanna was in full tears by now. As if you can make wet people wetter already, they cried. All you girls have this done. You'll be able to do it on someone else next term. It's very funny, really, and we haven't finished yet. They're sort of initiation tests. Before they could start another test, however, there was a knock on the door, and a prefect came in with a message for Susanna. Seeing the mess of water, she grew shocked and stern and made them clear it up at once. She made them pull the jersey from the light and draw the curtains back. The prefect happened to be Sarah. Charlotte had not spoken with her since the first day of term, and she was cold and distant now, though she did smile once in Charlotte's direction. When she had gone, Susanna cried, and Elizabeth started to laugh. Vanessa said how feeble they all were, not to take a joke. What rotten luck it was for her and Janet to be landed with such a wet lot as this. When the same trick had been played on them, they had not minded. Of course they hadn't. They weren't such spoil sports. Tricks like that had been played on new girls for absolutely donkey's years. Since before Sarah's mother came, she wouldn't wonder. Elizabeth stopped laughing at her after a little and became argumentative, waving her hands about to enforce her point. Why don't you grow up, you two, for goodness sake? Some people hate having water thrown in their faces, and I don't blame them one little bit. It's only meant to be a joke, Elizabeth, protested Janet. Vanessa said coldly, Oh, don't be such a prig. You can't talk anyway. You're a prig and Susanna's a crybaby, and Charlotte's just standoffish. She never says a word or talks to us. What a hopeless lot. Charlotte did not like being called standoffish much, but it was so difficult when she was only here every other day. Often she did not know what had happened, what was going on, and she was afraid of showing it, of saying things that might make everyone suspicious. It seemed safer usually not to speak at all. She wondered about Sarah's mother, whether she had had tricks played on her, whether they had been played in 1918 even. How long ago had Sarah's mother come to the school? She must be quite old now, with all her children grown up except for Sarah. She began, quite vaguely at first, to add up the dates, but then, after a while, added more accurately, more carefully, realizing with a shock that Claire and Emily, too, could be alive now in the present. In fact, they would be much younger than her grandfather Elijah. Charlotte was not at all sure she found that thought comfortable. She did not want to meet an elderly Emily while knowing the 10-year-old. And that is the end of chapter 4.